to be, it's telling you that it's going to be homozygous recessive. So when you look at the offspring, you're going to end up with 50% affected and 50% not affected. And then you look at this other family, they, the woman is the one that's affected with the widow's peak and the male isn't. Well, they have 2 children, 50% affected, 50% not. And so the child from this match and the child from this match, which are both affected, have 2 more offspring, one that is affected and one that's not affected. So based on this, and looking at the patterns of inheritance of those people that are affected, do you think widow's peak is a dominant or a recessive trait? Okay, well look at her. She's got a widow's peak, and she's got 2, she could have 2 different genotypes. She could be homozygous dominant, or she could be homozygous recessive. Now, if she was little w and had widow's peak, that would tell you that it's a recessive trait. But this is actually going to be a dominant trait, because you can see that you only need 1 copy of that dominant allele in order to show the phenotype.
Okay.
So in other words, people that don't have widow peaks, they're going to be the homozygous recessive. So me, I don't have a widow's peak, so I know that my genes are little w. And so everybody else who has a widow's peak, it means that they're going to have at least 1 copy of that dominant trait, or that dominant allele. And because you only need 1 copy of that dominant allele, that means that that's going to be a dominant trait. So if we look at another example, earlobes, you can have either attached earlobes or earlobes that kind of like, I don't know, flop in the wind. Think of Kiefer Sutherland. He's got like the largest earlobes. But anyways, and so you can either have attached earlobes or detached or free earlobes. And so if you follow this pedigree, we have 1 couple over here. Neither one of them are affected, but they have children, and they see half of them are affected. And then another couple, one's affected and one's not, or one has free earlobes and one doesn't. They have children, and then so one children from this match marries and mates with another children, or another offspring, and so they're going to end up with 2 children, half of them affected and half of them not affected. So do we think that attached earlobe, is this going to be a recessive or a dominant trait? Yeah, it's going to be recessive, because you need 2 copies of the recessive allele in order to see the phenotype. Whereas this, you're going to be normal, or free earlobe is considered kind of normal, and so that means you only have to have 1 copy of the dominant allele to remain normal, or to have that free earlobe. So basically, if you want to determine if a gene or a trait is showing recessive or dominance, all you have to do is look at the people that are affected. If the people that are affected with whatever trait you're looking at are little f, that automatically tells you that that trait is going to be recessive. In the previous example with the widow's peak, if you look at those that are affected and you see a dominant allele present, that tells you that that trait is acting in a dominant fashion. And so these diseases, or not even diseases, but these phenotypes, they can either act in a dominant fashion or they can act in a recessive fashion, depending on the different trait. And so the last little thing that we're going to talk about is what happens when we inherit recessive alleles that can result in disease. And so a lot of the diseases that are common to humans act in this recessive type manner, meaning that you need 2 copies of a mutant or a mutated gene in order to inherit a disease. And so a lot of these diseases are going to be like that. Cystic fibrosis, same thing. If you set up a Punnett square, let's just say you have 2 parents, and each one is heterozygous for the mutation in the cystic fibrosis gene. So if they have offspring, all right, 25% of them are going to be normal, have both healthy copies of the gene. 50% of them are going to be heterozygous, where they have one normal copy and one bad copy. And then 25% of them are going to be homozygous recessive, which means that these guys are going to be the ones affected by cystic fibrosis. So when these diseases are acting in these recessive manner, that basically means you need 2 mutated copies of that allele, or 2 mutated copies of that gene, in order to get the actual disease. Now you can still have these heterozygous individuals that are carrying the bad copy of the gene, but they're not showing the phenotype associated with it. And so we call basically heterozygous, we call them carriers, because they're carrying the bad copy of the gene. But because the gene is acting in a recessive manner, we have the normal copy of the gene, which is enough to make this individual normal. So carriers are going to be the people that carry the mutated gene, but are not showing the phenotypic effects of it. So in other words, these are going to be the heterozygous individuals. And so if we look at an example of one of these ailments caused by recessive inheritance, albinism is one of them. So people that are albino, they lack pigment in their hair and in their skin, and in their eyes even, so which is why they appear very, very, very pale with super, super blonde white hair. And so if you take parents that are both carriers, in other words, they're heterozygous, and they mate, they've got a 25% chance of seeing this double, or this homozygous recessive. And in that case, you end up creating a child that's albino. While her sister over here, she's going to be normal. She could either be heterozygous, she could be a carrier, or she could be completely normal and be homozygous dominant. And so a lot of the ways that these diseases arise are if you have this homozygous recessive condition, or this homozygous recessive inheritance. Questions? All right, last, I'm getting there, I promise. I know I keep saying it's the last one, but I'm pretty sure this is the last one. All right, so we talked about diseases that were being inherited in a recessive manner. There's also diseases that can be inherited in a dominant manner. So in a recessively inherited disease, you need 2 bad copies of the gene. In dominant alleles, or these dominantly inherited diseases, you only need 1 copy of the bad allele in order to see the phenotype. So an example of this is achondroplasia, which is dwarfism. And so in dwarfism, if you have one version of this capital D represents the mutation, or the dwarfism. So in individuals where you only have 1 copy of that, they're going to show the dwarf phenotype. And so in other words, normal is now going to look like the recessive. So you have 2 normal copies of the gene, you're going to be little d, little d. And so any parent or any organism that has this capital D is going to be a dwarf. And so if you mate a dwarf to someone who's normal, you're going to have a 50% chance of having offspring that are dwarfs, and 50% chance of them being normal. So this disease, it's not even really a disease, but this condition is going to be inherited in a dominant fashion, because in order to get the dwarf phenotype, you only need 1 copy of that dominant allele. And so that means that if you have 2 copies of the normal allele, then that's going to make you of normal height and not going to make you a dwarf.
What's that one family on TV? They have twin boys, one's a dwarf, one's not, and they have a regular-sized daughter and a regular-sized son. And the parents are dwarfs, so they got one dwarf child.
Yeah, that explains it. So that means that the child that they had that was of normal height, he's almost considered like a recessive, homozygous recessive, but that's normal in this case. And then those that are dwarfs, both the parents, they are going to be either big D, little d, or big D, big D. So just the presence of one of those big D's tells you you're automatically going to have a dwarf phenotype. So do y'all see the difference between recessively inherited diseases and dominantly inherited diseases? So dominantly inherited diseases, you only need 1 copy of that defective gene in order to see the disease. In recessively inherited diseases, you need to see 2 copies of that mutated gene in order to see the phenotype. I know it gets a little confusing because we would think that these homozygous recessive would be what's giving you the disease, but it's actually because this dwarf trait is dominant over normal, that's why we give it a capital D, even though it's the condition that we're looking at.
So for the dominant disease, you only need 1 copy of the gene, and the recessive you need 2 copies.
Exactly. Yeah, 1 copy of the mutated gene in the dominant inherited disease and 2 copies of the mutated gene in a recessively inherited disease. Ooh, I lied. But anyways, this is kind of a summary slide. This is the last slide, I know it is. This is kind of a summary slide. This isn't covering everything that we talked about, but it's at least looking at some of the different genetic characterizations. So it's looking at complete dominance, in other words, Mendelian inheritance, and then it's, you know, comparing and contrasting different effects that you can see, whether there's multiple alleles contributing to a phenotype, or whether there's codominance or incomplete dominance or pleiotropy. So that's your Mendelian genetics for the day. We're going to do an active learning right now.